My name is Cherring Spence. I live at 3000 here in Baltimore, Maryland. I've lived in Park Heights now for quite a few years. I moved to Baltimore from North Carolina in 1968. Being in the city of Baltimore was an exciting experience for me. And I saw the white marble steps here in the city. I saw Drew Hill Park with the huge fountain, which I loved. All of the neighborhoods were quite unique. They were beautiful when I moved here in the 60s, in the late 60s. And I moved right here in Park Heights. Well, no, at first I moved to Ashburton. I lived on Edgewood Street. That's where I first moved at. And we lived there approximately a year. And then I moved to the 3400 block of Virginia Avenue. That's where we bought our first home at here in Baltimore. And that too was a nice, very nice, quiet neighborhood. Everybody was friendly. We all knew our neighbors up, down, and around the street. And so it was a very good time for me. Then as the city changed later years, I moved to the east side of Baltimore. Didn't like that quite as much. It was a better neighborhood, but the people were not as friendly. I didn't know everybody the same way that I did in Park Heights. In later years, I ended up coming right back to Virginia Avenue, this time coming to the 3000 block of Virginia Avenue where I purchased my home and all, and I loved living there. I've seen quite a few changes. As I said, when I first came to Baltimore, it was just amazing to me to see the people out on Saturdays washing those marble steps. They weren't just washing them, they were scrubbing them until they seemed to just glisten, particularly in the sun. As years went by, you saw the communities, you saw the neighborhoods changing. You saw that people weren't quite as neighborly. You began to see the trash in different places. You begin to see more of the abandoned houses, and everybody was trying to figure out what was happening, you know, what was going on, why were all of these changes taking place throughout the city. We used to, I'm trying to think of the name of the place now, on Pennsylvania and North Avenue. We used to go there to what we call cabarets back during that time. And I mean, everybody was just out to have a good time. You didn't really have to be scared or fearful. You didn't have to worry about, you know, the shootings and where you're gonna be mugged and that kind of thing. So it was a whole different time than what I see all around me now. I even moved out of the area for a while. Yeah, I sold my house to some friends of mine. I moved out of the area. I went back to North Carolina to live because of health issues and all of that. And we were working on a committee during that time to the master plan. That was the master plan of 2004. We've had several in the Park Heights area, and we were actively working to bring some changes to the Park Heights community. And I moved away, but a friend of mine, she kept me informed as to what happened and what was going on. So we were excited that the master plan was going to be taking place in Baltimore. Unfortunately, by the time I returned a few years later, nothing had been done, and the city had deteriorated even more. I've had some experiences with different ethnic backgrounds, races, and primarily at work, because I worked for the Social Security Administration. I worked for the government for 21 years. Before retiring, I actually taught diversity classes as an EEO counselor. But then my life experiences, in the city, it seemed like the diversity contact was very limited. Most of the individuals that I was around were Black, like myself. There were no ethnic breakdowns in the community. It was only if I went to a store, if I went shopping, those that I worked with. That was the extent of the, interactions that I had. And it's unfortunate because at work, of course, you had people from all kinds of backgrounds, but when you came and lived in the community, it just was not so. It just was not so. Now it's a little different because I see a lot from the Hispanic heritage that are moving into the neighborhood. I had one young man that lived in my neighborhood right on Virginia Avenue. He was white. His mother, adopted mother, was Black. And oftentimes the kids used to tease him because he was the only Caucasian or white individual that lived in the neighborhood. And oftentimes I would find him sitting on my sidewalk or sitting near my steps, and I would often have conversation with him as to, his name was Curtis. I won't tell you what his last name was, but his name was Curtis. And I would often ask, Curtis, what is wrong today? What's going on? What's happening? And it was actually like reverse discrimination from what I had experienced myself, because he was being discriminated against because he was white. And the kids treated him terribly. And often he found refuge for whatever reason at my house. So he was always coming in, asking me if I had something to eat, telling me what went on that day, asking me, would I do something or help him out, and which oftentimes I did. And to this day, I still see him on occasion, and that's been a good 20-some years ago. To bring more unity in the community, which is something that I often say, and diversity, I think we really need to work on breaking down the barriers that exist, talking to one another, bringing diversity where you have people living, down the street from each other. And I guess to bring diversity in housing first, to bring diversity in economic breakdown of families. We often talk about the One Park Heights, which I'm working on a committee now called One Park Heights. But in order to do that, we really have to break down those economic barriers, those social barriers. We have to make education advantages greater for those that are less fortunate. And we have to begin to really just see each other as people, because when it's all when it's all said and done, that's what we are. I've got the same red blood running in my body that others, from various ethnic backgrounds have, but we tend to look at skin color. We look to how somebody talks, how they speak, to determine whether or not we want to have anything to do with them at all. I'm older than my sister and two of my brothers. They had such a different background experience growing up in the country even than I did. because I am much older than my sister. Most of her schoolmates were white. All of my schoolmates were black, which meant really most of her friends were white or Caucasian, and then later even Hispanic, which was a total different experience for me. And so it's always been odd for me. I always smile when I go to North Carolina and we're together and she greets people and she, says hi and they hug and she says, oh, this is so-and-so, we were schoolmates. Or, oh, this is so-and-so, they live down the street. That was not my experience growing up in North Carolina, nor has it been my experience here in Baltimore, where I live. Even today, if you look at the schools in my community, most of the people are from the same background or heritage. And so we've got to learn how, figure out a way to, I guess I would say, destroy the divide that exists and just bring people together more. That's the only way that I see where it can really be accomplished. We've got to learn how to love one another. We've got to learn how to respect one another. We've got to learn how to accept one another. We've got to learn how to overcome our fears. Quite frankly, they say that the biggest diversity that exists on a Sunday morning, or the most segregated place that exists on Sunday morning, actually happens in the church. I happen to be a pastor, and I believe that is true. Even to this day, I believe that is true. Because in most instances, when you go to church on Sunday morning, very rarely do you see a quote-unquote mixed congregation. If you do, there's only one or two people. There may be a handful of people. Yes, there are exceptions to that here in the city. I can think of one or two churches right off the top of my head that are what I would say truly mixed congregations. But for the most part, they're either black congregation, or they're a white congregation, or they're a Jewish congregation, or they are a Hispanic congregation, or whatever the nationality might be. And it's just hard to get people to really come together, even on Sunday morning. I really think that's the place where it starts at. I believe if we could break those barriers, I believe in the church, in the sanctuary, I believe it would go a long way in overcoming some of the woes that we face from day to day in terms of race relationships, in terms of backgrounds. I just believe it would help a lot. That's going to take longer than you have time for. My future aspirations for Northwest Baltimore would be getting rid of all of these abandoned houses, these vacant lots. It would be crossing the divide in terms of economic diversity. It's not just racial diversity, there's economic diversity that exists in our city. There is social diversity that exists. There are educational barriers that exist. And my dream for Park Heights in particular is much of what it was back in 2004 when I left. Seeing the tree-lined streets, not just north of Northern Parkway, but below Northern Parkway, where you don't see the trash and the streets littered, where you don't see all of the people hanging out on the corners because they have no jobs. It's not necessarily because they just want to be hanging out there. In many instances, it's because they have no job. They have no place to go. because there's so much trauma that's been experienced in and out of their home, where we have safe communities where people can really live. I mean, I had no fear when I first came to Baltimore. I had no fear walking down the street, walking through a neighborhood, walking through a community. Now, even though I'm much older now, and I don't do a whole lot of walking now like I used to, but even fearful to drive through certain areas, you know, because you're afraid that, you know, you're gonna be shot at or whatever. I had no problem coming up on Park Heights near Belvedere. There used to be the restaurant there, Yellow Bowl, years ago, where everybody used to come to eat, you know, and I would go there often to get my food. I would go into some of the Cinderella shoe stores, some of the other stores that existed during that time, and even down in Parklane Shopping Center. I had no problem going there. There used to be a restaurant, actually it was a Jewish restaurant, Duke and Lou's, if memory serves me correctly. Duke and Lou's, oh my goodness, that was the hangout. That's where everybody went to, and we had really a good time. You know, people felt so much safer. There was so much more of a sense of unity, community, neighborhood, or family during that time, and it just doesn't seem to exist right now. So that would be, you know, I know people often say, well, you can't go backwards, but we are going forward. We are advancing, and as we move forward into the future, as we advance into the future, I would like to see, you know, development, you know, real, what I call real development taking place in Park Heights in the Northwest Baltimore. I would like to see sit-down restaurants where you could take your family to, and you know, as I just look at it and think about it in my mind, there are no sit-down restaurants in Park Heights. I would like to see a library here in Park Heights where our children can go to and sit and read and learn. And I have a vision of Storyville. I have great-grandchildren now. When I first came here in 1968, I had a small baby with me. I now have great-grandchildren, and I'd like to take my great-grandchild Bash to what's called Storyville, which he loves it. In order to take him, I've got to go all the way to either Rosedale or Woodlawn to take him to the library. Well, Storyville is right next to the library. And I would love to be able to take him right here in Park Heights, to have him, you know, to just see him have that same experience, and my other great-grandchildren as well.